from stealing aspects of Greek culture and incorporating them into their own, right? So fashion, architecture, religion, all of those things, they at least were heavily influenced by the Greek versions of those things. And it's long been believed that the same goes with the meter for epic poetry. So specifically, for example, Virgil's meter for his poem The Aeneid is supposed to be inspired by Homer's meter for the Iliad and the Odyssey. So the Iliad and the Odyssey and many other Greek epic poems were written in Dactylic hexameter, which you can see here. And then the Aeneid is also written in Dactylic hexameter. And so Dactylic hexameter, it's a type of poetic meter, right? So you have heavy syllables and light syllables that are arranged in the form of heavy, light, light. And the dactyls in this example are highlighted in yellow. And then there's another very common type of poetic foot that appears throughout both Homer's poetry and also Virgil's, which is the spondee, and that is a poetic foot that consists of two heavy syllables. So dactylic hexameter in Latin poetry, it consists of dactyls and spondees. And so light syllables are syllables whose rhyme consists of a short vowel and nothing else. Right, and there's lots of examples here, like in the first line we've got ma and we, right, so just one short vowel and nothing else, no coda or anything. Heavy syllables are any other kind of syllable. Syllables with long vowels, syllables with codas, syllables with diphthongs, any combination in between. Latin can't have a combination of all three because they don't have long diphthongs, but I think some languages might. But yeah, so those are heavy syllables. And in Latin, there are 6 possible syllabic rhymes to make up a light syllable. A, E, I, O, U, and occasionally Y, only in loanwords, which is another thing that's stole from the Greeks. And then in heavy syllables, there are tons of possible combinations because you have all the same vowels, but you can lengthen them. You can make diphthongs. There's 5 diphthongs in Latin, and they can have codas. And so I think these are 90 examples of possible rhymes for heavy syllables, and there's a lot more because it doesn't have all of the diphthongs with codas. It doesn't have all of the long vowels with codas and stuff. So there's tons of them. So my first hypothesis was kind of intuitive. If Latin poetry is really in dactylic hexameter, it's going to be primarily dactylic. You'd think that we wouldn't have to, consider that, give it a name, but apparently we do, because that's not what happened. So I analyzed 60,000 feet from Virgil's epic poem, The Aeneid, and 54% of those feet were spondees. And then what was interesting was the final foot in every line, so the 6th foot, because it's hexameter, final foot was the only foot that never changed which type of foot it was, and it was always a spondee. And then I checked the eclogues, which is a series of poems written by Virgil, and they had a very similar result. 52% were spondees. So not quite as noticeable a difference, but still a bit of a preference for spondaic meter. And then, just like with the Aeneid, there was distinct preference for spondees at the final foot of every line. And in both poems, you got some trochees, which are heavy light, at the end of a line, but because of brevis and longo, or final lengthening, those light syllables at the very end turned into heavy syllables, so it turned into a spondee. And then Horace is another Augustan poet, and his poetry all matched Virgil's kind of in terms of dactyls versus spondees, where it was about 57% spondaic. Although interestingly, Horace did not have the same preference for spondees at the end of a line. He actually had no preference at all for spondees at the end of the line, because it was almost 50-50 in terms of whether a dactyl or a spondee was at the end. And then Ovid is third famous poet from that era. And interestingly, his data was the exact opposite of Horace's, where he did have a bit of a preference for dactyls, but he was very consistently spondaic at the end of the line. And so Hayes in 1989 states that the left edge of a line is determined by style, but then the right edge, the closer to the right edge of a line, the more strict it has to be based on the meter. And as we noticed in the examples of poets, the closer to the right edge of a line you got, the more spondaic the line became. And then the second hypothesis is that any preference for heavy syllables or light syllables in the poetry would be a result of some natural bias in the language. And so those 60,000 feet from Virgil's Aeneid amounted to 145,000 syllables, and 62% of those syllables were heavy, which also kind of goes against the idea that it could be dactylic, because if it was dactylic, it should be about 60% light, because heavy, light, 2/3 of that's light syllables. And then for the eclogues, I did 7,500 syllables, and 61% of those syllables were light. It's very consistent, which is nice. And then I analyzed 1,000 randomly selected words from the Latin dictionary. So that was 2,600 syllables, and 50% of those syllables were heavy. So we had a little over 60% for the poetry, and then 50% for the language itself. And then, interestingly, with Cicero, who, for those of you not familiar with Cicero, he was not a poet, but he was an orator, so he wrote speeches, so all of his stuff is prose. In his first oration, I did the first 700 syllables, and just like with Latin, or the poetry, 60% of those syllables were heavy. So despite the language having an obvious preference for heavy, despite the language not having an obvious preference for heavy or light syllables, it was almost completely 50-50. The poetry was all significantly skewed towards heavy syllables. Which begs the question, if there's no underlying preference for heavy syllables in the language, what caused this preference in poetry? So according to Golston and Riyad, one of the ways of making meter distinguishable is by using clash, or at least an unnatural use of clash. Because clash is kind of jarring when you have a lot of it, so we kind of tend to structure our language in a way that doesn't really incorporate that a lot. But some poets like to use this because it sounds so distinctly different from natural speech. And clash comes from having two stressed syllables together. And so heavy syllables are always stressed, and when you have a pair of light syllables, the first light syllable is stressed. So you'll have stress in spondees, which are two heavy syllables. You'll have stress in dactyls, which is a heavy syllable followed by a pair of light syllables, because that first light syllable is going to be stressed. But you're not going to have stress in trochees, which are heavy light, and you're not going to have clash in trochees, which is heavy light, and you're not going to have clash in anapests, which is light, heavy, right? And so you can kind of see that here, where the X's correspond with stress, and the underscores correspond with no stress. And so you can see with the spondees, you have that clash there, because you've got the two X's next to each other, and same with dactyls, but not with trochees or anapests. So Homer used a lot of clash in his poetry, which the pattern for that kind of looks like this with your with all the dactyls. So you have two two stressed syllables and then an unstressed syllable and then two stressed syllables and an unstressed syllable. So there was a lot of clash in that. And then Virgil also used a lot of clash, but he used a lot more because he used primarily spondees. And so his pattern for stress looks like this, where it's just a lot of stress and therefore a lot of clash. So dactyls, they produce stress within feet, so across syllables but within feet. But spondees produce clash both across syllables and across feet. So with the dactyls up here, right, each foot ends with a stressless syllable, and so there's no clash going between the feet. But with here, each of these feet, every pair of heavy syllables ends with a stressed syllable, which means, and the next one starts with a stressed syllable, so there's going to be a lot of clash between the feet as well. So I was wondering why there'd be such a preference for heavy syllables in these words, or sorry, why these, if there's such preference for heavy syllables, why it wasn't entirely written in heavy syllables, why it wasn't entirely written in spondees. And the problem with that is just you can't write a poem in Latin with just heavy syllables. Because as we saw with the data from the dictionary, there's clearly a lot of light syllables in the language. There's about as many light syllables in the language itself as there are heavy syllables in the language, even though there are so many more possible ways of producing a heavy syllable. I was also interested in determining whether the significance of the heavy syllables in the poetry was a result of the literary content, or if it was reflective of that. Because the Aeneid is notoriously considered a very heavy poem, but and so that kind of makes sense. But for one thing, Saussure says that there's no correlation between sound and meaning; it's all arbitrary. But also, we could tell that this isn't the case because the poems that we analyzed, the Aeneid and the Eclogues, for example, they're very different in terms of tone, right? The Aeneid is this great war story, and it's about the founding of Rome, and so it's got a lot of very serious, very epic kind of content. And then the Eclogues is about farming, which, you know, it's going to have kind of a different tone. So clearly, literary content doesn't have anything to do with this. And one interesting thing that came out of this is that while most theorists treat meter and rhythm as being inherently connected, this kind of suggests otherwise on account of the meter is primarily spondaic and therefore it's not really rhythm. So in conclusion, our first hypothesis was that Latin poetry would be primarily dactylic because it's supposed to be in dactylic hexameter, and that was not correct. 54% of the feet in the Aeneid, 52% of the feet in the Eclogues were spondees, and we could see this in other poets' work as well. And then my second hypothesis was that any preference for heavy syllables or light syllables in the poetry would be a result of a natural bias in the language, and this was also not the case in that the language had no preference at all for heavy or light syllables, and the poetry had a clear preference for heavy syllables. And then, as mentioned earlier, the closer to the right edge of a line you get, the stricter the meter gets in terms of straying from the underlying meter of the poem. And throughout all of Virgil's poems and throughout many of the other poems of the same era, the final foot in every line was spondee. So therefore, we can conclude that Latin poetry was not written in dactylic hexameter, but it was actually written in spondaic hexameter. Thank you.
Aeneas carried it on his back from Greece,
From Troy.
from Troy to Italy.
Yes. So there was second city at the end of it.
That's really interesting. That was great. One question about the Aeneid and the dactyls and spondies in there. With that, the case where every line ends with the spondee, does just those final feet of each line account for that difference in the ratio of dactyls and spondies in that? Would you think? I mean, if we took away that preference, would it be more 50-50, do you think?
If I recall correctly, when I did the analysis of the numbers, I don't believe I included the final foot. I would have to double check. It's been a while since I did that data.
Yeah, just seeing that huge preference for spondies in, I don't remember the percentages, what was it, like 2/3 to a third or so, 2/3 spondies. I wonder if a good deal of that would come from that preference.
Yeah,
for whatever
I'm
reason.
pretty sure I didn't include the final. I think I did it all for the first 5 feet per line. I'm like 90% positive.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm gonna double check that though, because that is obviously a valid concern. But I'm pretty sure it was just for the first 5 feet per line on here.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think this is really great. Thank you. I just had a question. Because you said, particularly it was the second set of poems of Virgil's you had looked at.
Yeah,
There were some of the last feet that weren't underlying spondees.
Yes.
They were trochees, right?
Yes.
So what is preventing an analysis of this still being a dactylic with kind of a degenerate foot at the end, if you had some instances that weren't underlying spondees?
I'm not sure, because from what I gather, it's generally entirely accepted that Latin always use brevis and longo, final lengthening, in its poetry. I think Mester 94, I believe, talks about that.
He did, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I'm not sure how to determine if it would be a degenerate foot or not.
I'm just curious. Thank you. That's such a great.
I'm not sure if you can answer this, but in the Renaissance, I know that they try to imitate these sort of Greek metrics in Romance languages, actually in Germanic languages too. Do you know if anybody tried to imitate dactylic?
I have no idea.
I know they did iambic, which makes sense for languages
Right.
with lots of
Yeah.
Does anybody? Was that?
That would be bonkers. Then.
Yeah, that would be good.
Yeah, I have no idea. Not quite old enough for.
You're not quite old enough for the Renaissance?
Community, not quite old enough for. Yeah, I have no idea. That'd be interesting. I don't think, just based on what I do know about poetry from that era, I do think I hear a lot more, but generally about iambic meter and
Right.
and trochaic, whereas I don't think I've heard much about dactylic meter in that time.
Yeah.
But I mean, if they're, because the whole theme of the Renaissance was kind of, Neo-Romanism, and so it would make sense for someone to try and
Somebody
to
had tried
imitate
it.
that, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So then the question is, did they actually do it in dactylic or spondaic?
Yeah, very interesting to see. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you about how you use the dictionary to determine sort of the overall language preference for heavy versus light syllables. I don't know much about Latin, but I know there was case, right?
Yes, case.
So I'm just wondering if maybe the forms that you see in the dictionary, in order for them to actually be used in the language, they would have to be inflected for case. And I'm just wondering if there's morphological processes or maybe phonological processes that affect stress placement that could mean that the percentage of heavy light that you see in the dictionary maybe doesn't reflect how it's actually used.
Yeah. So with the tricky thing with Latin poetry specifically, and this is relevant to the dictionary stuff. The tricky thing with Latin poetry is there's this thing called elision, where just because a word ends with an M or something like that, doesn't mean that the syllable that it's in is going to be heavy, because sometimes the next syllable will steal that M
Right.
to use
Makes
as
sense.
coda, which is just horrible when it comes to scansion. And so because of that, I went into it knowing that you can't really judge that final syllable of any word that you just pull out of context,
Right.
because whatever that is might not stay that way when you put it into a poetic context. And so I did all of it analyzing up to the final syllable from the dictionary. So I didn't look at the final syllable because that could change and stuff like that. I was curious as to whether the case endings might influence it, but again, I think part of that, when you put it into the context of prose, for example, with Cicero, is that it gets resyllabified, and so I don't think it actually accounts for that difference. Yeah, because that was like the first thing I thought of was maybe this, but I think the resyllabification kind of doesn't allow for that.
So, coming back to your title and conclusion, I think it was a beautiful talk. Can you speculate why everybody says that it's not? I mean, this is a stupid question, really, but
Right.
could it, so making it somewhat more relevant, would it be possible that there's more freedom at the beginning of the line, and as Bruce Hayes argued, that people literally paid attention to that? What's
Yeah,
your
it's possible. And I know. Is that Horace or Ovid? Okay, I don't know which one it was. One of them always, or at least tried to always start every line with a dactyl. So I think some of them were trying to imitate the Greek meter, because I think, like I mentioned when I started talking about Clash, I think it's not that it's a completely different thing. I think they were inspired by the Greek way of doing it, and then they just wanted to really expand upon that. Because with the Clash, it was basically they were trying to get a certain sound that really made it obvious that they're doing poetry or something, and they liked the way that Homer did it with Clash, and they figured we'll do that. We'll just really do it in case you missed it with Homer, really gonna hammer it. So, but yeah, so I think they were inspired by the Greek poets, which would explain why there might be a lot of more dactyls in the first half of the line. Yeah.
Did you look into at all like the frequency of words, of different words? Because like if you're looking at the dictionary as a whole, like some of those words might actually be very rare, and they might have like systematically different like syllable weights or whatever than those that are more frequent. Did you look at that at all?
No, I don't look at